The fluorescent lights buzzed softly as Grace Walker pushed open the swinging double doors to the ER. The familiar scent of antiseptic met her like an old, weary friend. She adjusted the stethoscope around her neck and tied her chestnut hair into a quick ponytail, her movements practiced, automatic. Another night shift, 12 hours of steady motion, tired eyes and hands that sometimes held life and sometimes let it slip away. The hospital was small, tucked between a community college and a gas station that never closed. The kind of place where everyone eventually passed through. Accidents on old country roads, asthma attacks during harvest season, fevers that wouldn't break in the middle of the night. Grace had worked here since she graduated, longer than she meant to. She often told herself she'd leave someday, find a bigger city, a better facility. But she never did. Something about this place kept her rooted. Tonight felt no different. Her sneakers squeaked against the tile as she made her rounds, checking vitals, offering quiet comfort to families half asleep in stiff plastic chairs. One patient had stitches, another waited on labs. Routine, steady, manageable. It wasn't until 2:14 a.m. that something shifted. "Ambulance incoming," came the call from triage. "Male, late 70s, found unconscious on a park bench near the war memorial. No ID." Grace was already pulling on gloves as the gurney burst through the doors, flanked by two paramedics. The man on the stretcher was gaunt, sun-worn, with deep lines carved into his face like battle scars. His clothes were clean but old, a faded flannel, threadbare jeans. Tucked under his arm was a military jacket, the kind you only wore if it meant something. "Vitals?" she asked quickly. "BP low, shallow breathing," one paramedic replied. "He came to for a second, said something about a woman, but we couldn't make out the name." They wheeled him into room 3. Grace stayed with him as the team moved around her. Oxygen, monitors, questions that went unanswered. His eyes flickered open just once. Pale blue, searching. She leaned in close. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're not alone." His hand twitched toward hers. Without hesitation, she took it. It was cool, rough with age and time, but the grip, even weak, held something intentional. "You made it to the hospital," she said gently, not expecting a response. "We'll take care of you." He didn't speak again, but his fingers never let go. Grace stayed until the monitors slowed and then stilled. No family arrived. No one called to ask about him. Just a nurse and a stranger whose final moments were witnessed, not ignored. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows like a quiet sigh. Grace slipped the military jacket over him before they took him away. Whatever his name was, wherever he came from, he hadn't died unseen. And for Grace, that mattered. The second he was wheeled through the sliding doors, the air in the ER changed. It wasn't just the urgency or the murmured codes over the intercom. It was something else, a hush that followed him like an unseen shadow. Grace glanced up from the chart she was reviewing and immediately moved toward the gurney. The man looked ancient, not just in age but in the way stone monuments look, weathered by storms no one else had seen. His skin was papery, stretched tight over sharp bones, and his lips were tinged faintly blue. Draped over his chest was a worn military jacket, its patches faded but unmistakable. U.S. Army. A bronze star ribbon stitched into the fabric. Grace's breath caught for a moment. "No ID," the EMT said quickly. "Unconscious when we found him. Park ranger said he'd been there all day, just sitting at the edge of the woods." "Vitals." "BP's low. We gave him oxygen and fluids in transit. No visible trauma, no external bleeding. Just something shutting down." Grace nodded. "Let's get him to bed 4." The gurney rattled as they moved. Grace walked beside him, her hand on the rail, eyes scanning his face for any flicker of awareness. There was none, but his fingers twitched once beneath the blanket, a subtle movement that felt more like memory than reflex. As they settled him in and hooked up the monitors, Grace noticed the inside pocket of his jacket was bulging. She hesitated, then reached in. A tattered photograph slid into her hand, a younger version of him in uniform, arm wrapped around a smiling woman with dark curls and eyes that looked like they held secrets. On the back, in smeared ink, "Always you, always her." She stared at it for a beat too long. "We're running labs now," another nurse said, breaking her focus. "But this doesn't look like something blood work is going to fix." Grace nodded, tucking the photo back in place. He was still unconscious, but his chest rose and fell with a slow, measured rhythm. His jacket had slipped down slightly, revealing a faded tattoo on his forearm. Honor above all. She gently pulled the blanket higher. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he came from or who would want to know he was here. But the jacket, the tattoo, the photo, these things spoke louder than any chart ever could. "Let's keep him warm," she said softly, "and stay close." The machines beeped steadily beside him, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken had just arrived with him, something waiting, patient and unfinished. And she intended to stay long enough to find out what. The room was still, save for the rhythmic beep of the monitor and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Grace sat beside the bed, chart in her lap, though her eyes kept drifting to the man lying just inches away. He hadn't stirred since they brought him in, still as a shadow, except for the slow, deliberate rise and fall of his chest. She had seen death before, too many times to count. But something about this man resisted that silence. It was in the way his fingers occasionally flexed, as though gripping something just out of reach, or the faint crease between his brows like he was chasing a memory. It was past 3 a.m. when he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, murky blue, dulled by time and fatigue, but sharp enough to make Grace sit up straighter. She leaned in, careful not to startle him. "You're in the hospital," she said softly. "You passed out, but you're safe now." His gaze swept the room as if looking for something, or someone. His lips moved, dry and cracked. Grace brought a cup of water to his mouth, letting a sip pass between his lips. He coughed gently, then whispered, "Did she make it?" Grace blinked, leaning closer. "Who? Who are you waiting for?" "Emily," he breathed. "She was supposed to. I told her I'd wait." The name fell from his lips like a prayer, half spoken, half forgotten. His hand reached out weakly, fingers curling in the air. Grace didn't ask more. She simply took his hand in both of hers and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I'm here," she said, voice calm and sure. "You're not alone." He blinked again, eyes glassy, but some flicker of peace crossed his face. A breath deeper than the last passed his lips, as though he'd been holding it for decades and was finally letting go. Then the moment faded. His eyes closed once more, and his grip softened, settling back into stillness. Grace didn't let go. She stayed there, holding his hand long after the machines returned to their steady rhythm, after the room sank back into quiet. His words echoed in her thoughts. "She was supposed to. I told her I'd wait. A promise made long ago. A promise maybe never kept." She didn't know who Emily was, but the name would stay with her, just like his voice, just like the way he had looked at the door, as though someone he loved might walk through it at any moment. And so Grace kept watching the door too, just in case. The next morning, the sunlight crept in through the narrow blinds, casting long bars of gold across the hospital floor. Grace was already by his side when his eyes opened again. No panic, No confusion this time. Just quiet awareness, like he'd finally remembered where he was. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Whatever strength he'd summoned the night before seemed gone now, buried under layers of exhaustion and time. But his gaze was sharp, deliberate. He looked at Grace with the weight of someone who had seen too much and said too little for far too long. She smiled gently, pouring warm water over a towel and dabbing it across his forehead. His brow furrowed, not in discomfort but in the kind of surprise that comes from kindness without a price tag. Grace didn't explain what she was doing. She just moved slowly, respectfully, letting silence fill the spaces where words weren't needed. When she adjusted the blanket over his chest, he winced, not from physical pain, but something deeper. His eyes flickered to the window and stayed there. Grace followed his gaze. A tree. The breeze moving gently through its thinning leaves. The world kept turning, unaware that someone was slipping away inside these walls. "You miss outside, huh?" she said softly. "Me too, some days." He blinked once. A response. Grace pulled a chair closer, sitting where he could see her without strain. The machines continued their quiet song. She didn't fill the space with talk, just presence. She began reading aloud from a book someone had left in the waiting room. Something about soldiers, not war, not combat, just the quiet moments, the ones between the chaos. He watched her lips move, listened with something close to reverence. And when she paused, he lifted one hand with effort, pointing slightly to his jacket on the side table. She reached for it, lifting it carefully. From one of the inside pockets, she withdrew a small photograph, faded and creased, edges worn thin. A woman, smiling beside a soldier in uniform, their hands clasped tightly. The joy in the photo was palpable. "Emily," Grace said quietly, remembering the name he had whispered. His fingers brushed the photo once, then fell still. His eyes locked with hers, grateful, tired, hurting. Grace held the photo in both hands, nodding slowly. "She's beautiful," she said. The veteran didn't reply, but tears pooled silently at the corners of his eyes, and he didn't blink them away. Grace stayed with him until his breathing slowed into sleep again, the photograph resting on his chest. She understood now. It wasn't just his body that was giving out. It was his heart, heavy with the ache of unfinished goodbyes. Later that evening, as the rhythm of the ER settled into its usual lull of monitors and whispered updates, Grace returned to his room. The old man was asleep, his breath shallow but steady, lips slightly parted, as though even dreams had grown too heavy to carry. She checked his vitals, adjusting the IV line, then gently lifted his wrist to check circulation. That's when she saw it. A narrow band of worn leather, tucked almost entirely under his sleeve, its presence so subtle she might have missed it. It wasn't hospital-issued. Too personal. Too old. She rolled back the sleeve carefully. A bracelet. The leather was cracked and soft from age, but still intact. Etched into the surface, faint but legible, were two things. A name, Dawson, HT, and a series of numbers beneath it. The last 4 digits looked familiar. A service number, probably military. Grace held his wrist a little longer than necessary. She had seen these before, sometimes worn by veterans as a link to their past, sometimes by those waiting for someone who never returned. Either way, they weren't fashion. They were memory. She reached for her notepad and scribbled the information down quietly. She didn't want to disturb him, but something about the bracelet felt significant, like a thread back to a story no one else had finished reading. She double-checked the name and numbers, then eased his sleeve back into place. His fingers twitched faintly, as if in recognition, but he didn't wake. Back at the nurse's station, Grace opened her laptop and entered the details into a military record search. The database was clunky, outdated, and rarely used in an ER setting. But she figured if this bracelet was what she thought it was, someone, somewhere, would have a record. As the screen blinked and searched, Grace leaned back and glanced down the hallway toward his room. She didn't know what she was hoping to find. A next of kin, a history, a connection, maybe even someone looking for him. The screen finally loaded. Henry Thomas Dawson, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army, retired. Service commendations, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Status, unknown. No next of kin listed. She stared at the page. Unknown. Grace closed the screen and looked again at her notes, her pen resting on the edge of the bracelet's numbers. Whatever his story was, it didn't end here. Not in a sterile hospital room with no name and no family. She made a silent promise to herself as she set the notebook aside. You weren't forgotten. Not while I'm here. The night shift rolled on, slower now, as most of the ER slipped into a lull. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting pale halos on the polished floors. The occasional rustle of paperwork or distant monitor beep echoed faintly. But in room 4, time seemed to move differently. Gentler, quieter. Grace had finished her rounds. Charts updated, vitals checked, patients stable. Still, she lingered in the doorway, eyes drawn to the still figure in the bed. No one had called. No next of kin showed up. No emergency contacts, no visitors, not even a name beyond what she had found etched into the leather bracelet. Henry Thomas Dawson, Lieutenant Colonel, decorated, forgotten. She moved inside without a word and pulled a chair close to the bedside. The old man lay curled slightly to one side, the lines on his face deeper now, his breath thin but present. She smoothed the blanket over his shoulder, instinct guiding her more than procedure. I'll stay with you, she whispered. She didn't expect a response. But slowly, so slowly she almost missed it, his hand moved beneath the blanket. Reached. Not far, just a few inches toward the edge of the bed. She met it with her own. His fingers closed around hers with a grip far stronger than she anticipated. Not panicked, not desperate, just deliberate, as though he was holding on to the only real thing in the world. She held back, gently but firmly, anchoring him in the quiet of the moment. Outside the room, the hospital moved on. Nurses swapped stories at the desk. A janitor pushed a mop down the hallway. Somewhere down the corridor, a baby cried, and then fell silent. But in room 4, it was just the two of them. A man who had given his life to service, and a nurse who refused to let that life end in silence. Grace sat with him through the hours that usually felt endless. She didn't check her phone. She didn't read. She just stayed. And when his breathing hitched or slowed, she'd press his hand lightly and whisper, Still here. Sometime before dawn, his grip loosened. Not from fear or pain, just weariness. Like his body had finally allowed itself to rest. But she didn't let go. She knew what it meant to be alone at the edge of something final. And she wouldn't let him face it without someone beside him. Not tonight. The first hints of dawn pressed against the hospital windows, casting soft pink light across the sterile tiles. The night had stretched long and silent, broken only by the occasional stir of a nurse or a distant murmur over the intercom. In room 4, Grace sat where she had been for hours, her hand still clasped in his. Henry's breathing had grown slower over the past hour, each rise and fall of his chest more fragile than the last. His skin had grown cooler, the color around his lips grayer. But there was no panic in him, no resistance, only a gentle surrender. Grace leaned in as his eyes opened once more, just barely. His gaze wasn't frantic or confused, it was steady. a final effort to connect. "Mr. Dawson," she whispered, her voice soft and reverent. "It's okay. I'm here." His lips parted. A sound came out, a faint rasp that barely reached her ears. She leaned closer. "Tell her." "Thank you," he breathed. Her eyes welled, but she nodded, squeezing his hand gently. "I will. I promise." He gave the faintest smile, a whisper of peace crossing his face. "I kept my promise," he murmured, and then his breath left him. There was no dramatic moment, no monitor flatline, no alarm, just stillness. The kind that arrives so quietly, it takes a second to notice it has settled in for good. Grace didn't move at first. She sat with him, her hand still in his, absorbing the weight of his final words. Whoever her was, whatever promise he had kept, it mattered. Enough that it was the last thing he carried across that threshold between here and gone. She gently laid his hand back onto the blanket and brushed his hair from his forehead like a mother might with a sleeping child. Then she stood, turned off the monitor, and whispered, "Rest easy, soldier. You're not forgotten." Outside, the sun finally crested the horizon, spilling golden light through the ER. And inside, Grace Walker wrote down the last words of a man who died a stranger to most, but not to her. By mid-morning, Room 4 had already been prepped for its next patient. The sheets were changed, the machines reset, the quiet dignity of death replaced with the sterile efficiency of protocol. To the hospital, it was another chart closed, another body transferred to the morgue, another checkbox marked. Grace stood at the nurse's station, watching as the mortuary attendant wheeled the gurney down the hall. No one stopped to watch. No one asked who he was. He had come in without a name, and now he was leaving the same way. But for Grace, something stayed behind. She reviewed the death certificate, unsigned. Under name, it still read, John Doe, estimated age 80s. The bracelet she'd found remained tucked in a drawer with his jacket and the old photograph, items too personal to be discarded, too important to belong to no one. "How long do we keep unclaimed personal effects?" she asked casually, looking up from the chart. 72 hours, one of the techs replied. After that, they go to storage unless someone files a request. Grace nodded slowly. And what happens to the body if no one comes forward? State takes over. Cremation or burial. Depends on policy. The finality of it struck her. After a life that had clearly meant something, medals, promises, a name whispered at the end. This was how it ended. 3 days in a drawer and a quiet disappearance into bureaucracy. She couldn't let that happen. Later that afternoon, during her lunch break, she walked into the supervisor's office. The head nurse, a woman named Patrice, with years of clinical detachment built into every decision, looked up with polite disinterest. "I'd like to submit a request," Grace said, steady but hesitant. "To follow up on the man in room 4, the one who passed this morning." "Which patient?" "The elderly veteran. No ID, wore a military bracelet. I wrote down his name, Henry Thomas Dawson." Patrice raised an eyebrow. "Grace, I understand you're compassionate, but these things happen all the time. He came in with no information. You stayed with him, which is admirable. But we don't have resources for this kind of closure." Grace didn't flinch. "I'm not asking the hospital to do anything, just permission to follow up on my own time. I believe he served. I found a service number. I think there's more to his story." A pause. "Fine," Patrice said at last, sighing. "Just keep it off the clock, and if anyone calls asking, I'll forward them to you." "Thank you." Grace left the office with a quiet sense of purpose, her mind already racing through what steps she'd take next. because something inside her refused to believe that Henry Dawson's story ended on a gurney in a nameless ER. Not while she still had questions. Grace's apartment was quiet, too quiet, on her first day off. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, untouched beside a stack of notes scribbled on hospital stationery. A copy of the bracelet's inscription sat on top. Dawson, HT-147-6-2-8841. She opened her laptop again, scrolling through veteran memorial registries, military personnel databases, and digital archives that hadn't seen proper updates in years. Each search felt like prying open a sealed door, only to find more questions behind it. The Department of Veterans Affairs redirected her 3 times. The first operator asked if she was next of kin. The second hung up after transferring her to a line that rang endlessly. The third offered a form to request military service records, which would take up to 90 days. Grace filled it out anyway. She didn't have 90 days, but she also didn't have a better lead. On the second day, she called a local American Legion chapter. A gruff voice answered, cautious but curious once she mentioned the bracelet. "Dawson, you said?" "Henry Thomas," the man repeated. "Sounds familiar. Could be one of ours. We had a Dawson back in the 80s. Served in Vietnam, I think. Disappeared after his wife died. Never came back around. Was his wife's name Emily?" A pause. "Yeah. Emily Dawson. Nice woman. Real sweet. He lost her to cancer. After that, he stopped coming to meetings. Nobody could reach him." Grace's heart skipped. It fit. The name he whispered, the photo in his jacket, the pain behind his silence. "Do you know if he has family?" "None that we knew. No kids. But I can check. Try the regional vet records office too. They might still have his discharge file." She thanked him, jotted down the number, and made another call. Hours blurred into each other. One voicemail led to another. Each gatekeeper needed proof she didn't have. Authorization she couldn't give. More than once, she wanted to scream into the receiver, "He died holding my hand. Isn't that enough?" But she didn't. Instead, she kept going. Late that night, just as she was about to shut down for the evening, an email popped into her inbox. Subject: Inquiry. Re. Dawson, Henry T. It was short, just a scanned document confirming his service record and a notice. Declared inactive, missing from military contact as of 1993. Status: retired. No living dependents on file. Grace stared at the screen. He had faded from the system decades ago. Disconnected, erased, but not forgotten. Not now. She closed the laptop and looked over at the photograph she'd copied from his pocket, now framed and resting on her bookshelf. A man in uniform, a woman at his side. Frozen in a happier time. "I found you," she whispered. It wasn't the end of the search, but it was the start of his story being told again. Grace leaned back in her chair, the glow of her laptop screen casting soft shadows on the walls of her dim apartment. Her eyes burned from hours of reading, but the words on the page kept pulling her in. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Thomas Dawson, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in Desert Storm, retired 1993. Status: no further military contact post-discharge. The scan she'd received from the archives office confirmed it. Henry Dawson wasn't just another name on a forgotten registry. He was a decorated war hero. A man who had survived 3 wars, led men into battles most wouldn't return from, and had once stood at the center of national defense. And yet, somehow, he'd slipped through every system designed to honor men like him. She pulled out the photograph again, the one of Henry and Emily. Their joy radiated from the faded image, like they hadn't just been smiling for a camera, but for a life they still believed they'd have. A life that, from what Grace could gather, ended with loss and silence. Digging further, she found an old article from a 1984 local newspaper. Lieutenant Colum Dawson, honored for heroism in Operation Urgent Fury. The photo showed him in uniform, saluting beside a general. The caption read, "A quiet man of action, Dawson declined interviews, citing the sacrifices of his men." That was Henry, a man who never sought recognition, a man who gave everything, and when there was nothing left to give, disappeared. She sat with that for a long time. The pieces of his life began to form a story: honor, duty, love, and then retreat. After his wife passed, he seemed to vanish. No pension claims, no veterans' benefits, no property, just ghosted from the world. Not because he was forgotten, but because maybe he had chosen it. Maybe his grief had grown too heavy and the world too loud. But that didn't sit right with Grace. Not anymore. This wasn't just a forgotten patient with no ID. This was a man who had carried burdens few could understand. A man whose last moments had been shaped by memories no one else witnessed. She picked up the phone and called the American Legion contact again. When he answered, she didn't wait. "His name was Henry Dawson," she said. "He didn't just serve, he led, and I think he deserves more than a line in a morgue file." There was silence on the other end. Then, "You're right. Tell me what you need." Grace looked at the bracelet on her desk, the etching still faintly visible under her lamp. "I want to give him a name again," she said, "and a farewell someone remembers." The envelope arrived 3 days later, tucked among a stack of routine mail on Grace's kitchen counter. Plain, cream-colored, addressed in tight, looping cursive that looked like it belonged to another time. No return address, no postmark. Just her name, written carefully. Grace Walker, R.N. She opened it cautiously, sliding her finger along the flap, her pulse quickening for reasons she couldn't explain. Inside was a folded piece of stationery, yellowed at the edges and worn thin along the creases. It had clearly been handled often, read, perhaps reread, and yet never mailed. Until now. The handwriting matched the envelope. The ink, slightly faded, traced delicate lines across the page. "Dear Henry, I don't know where you are, or if this letter will ever find you, but I'm writing anyway. Maybe it's foolish, but that's never stopped me before. The house is quiet now. Too quiet. I still hear your boots on the porch some mornings, still expect your voice on the wind. I made your favorite stew last Tuesday. Cried when I realized no one would be home to eat it. I wish you'd let me in more. I know you were hurting after the war, even if you never said it. But I also know you carried everyone else's pain, so no one had to carry yours. That's who you were. That's why I loved you. If you find this, if you come home someday, I'll be waiting at the swing behind the church, the one we used to sneak off to when we were young and the world still felt wide. But if I'm not there, just know, you were never alone in the end. Not really. I was with you every day, even when you pushed me away. I never stopped being yours. With love, always, Emily." Grace read it once, then again, then a third time, unable to stop the tears from slipping down her cheeks. She imagined the moment Emily had written it, sitting at a small kitchen table, hands trembling, trying to bridge the chasm Henry had built around himself. The letter had never been mailed. Maybe she'd lost faith he'd come back. Maybe she passed away before she could send it. But someone, somewhere, had held on to it. And now, by fate or coincidence, it had found its way into Grace's hands. She folded the letter back carefully, holding it against her chest. Henry had kept his promise. In the end, even when he was too weak to speak, Even when he couldn't find his way back to her in life, he had carried her with him. And now, through some quiet miracle, Emily's words had found their way back to him too. Grace whispered. She was waiting. She never stopped. It was a box of old papers that led her to the truth. Grace found it at the American Legion post, forgotten in a dusty storage closet, handed over by a volunteer who had heard she was looking into Henry's past. It had no label, just his initials scribbled in fading marker on the lid. She brought it home, setting it gently on her kitchen table, like an artifact pulled from a wreck. Inside were fragments of a life unraveled. Discharge forms, commendation certificates, faded photographs, one of a young Henry Dawson, arm slung around another soldier, both laughing, wild-eyed, and sunburned. The back was labeled, "Me and Sam, Fall of '72, Quang Tree." Beneath it was a notebook, the leather cover worn thin. Grace opened it, fingers trembling. Inside, neat handwriting filled the pages, notes, names, addresses, crossed-out cities. But one page caught her breath. Find Emily Harrow, last known in New York. Sam made me promise, if anything happened, I'd tell her he never stopped loving her. Sam, the man in the photo. Emily, not Henry's wife. Sam's. Grace sat back, stunned. Henry had spent years searching for a woman who wasn't his own, not out of love, but loyalty. A promise made in the mud and fire of war, a dying man's last request. She kept reading. I found an Emily Harrow in Kansas. Wrong one. Another in Ohio. Husband answered. Said she died in '94. Couldn't tell if it was her. Still looking. Will always look. Page after page, the notes continued. Veterans' hospitals, church records, obituary clippings. Henry had traced her through decades and distance, piecing together a map of grief and honor. He hadn't disappeared after the wars because he was lost. He disappeared because he had a mission. One final task, one final act of friendship. Grace stared at the letter from Emily, still resting on her counter. If Henry had believed she was gone, maybe he had stopped searching. Or maybe he'd found her too late, and the silence was too much to bear. But he had held on to the photo, to the promise, right to the end. She picked up the bracelet again, the worn leather familiar now, like something sacred. The numbers, the name, they weren't just remnants of service. They were his compass, his tether to a vow that had outlived everyone who had heard it spoken. Grace whispered aloud, "You didn't fail him, Henry. You kept your word." The weight of his quiet, uncelebrated mission settled deep in her chest, and for the first time since his passing, Grace felt she understood the man who had slipped from the world without a sound. He had died with peace because, in the end, someone finally heard what he'd never said. The military records office was tucked inside a squat concrete building just off the interstate. Unmarked, nondescript, the kind of place you'd pass 100 times and never think twice about. Grace had called ahead, unsure if they'd even entertain her request. But when she mentioned Henry's name and the service number from the bracelet, there was a pause, a shift in tone, then a quiet. "Come in. Bring what you have." Inside, everything smelled of paper and time. Rows of file cabinets stretched like sentinels down dim corridors, and the clicking of a lone keyboard echoed faintly through the walls. Grace was led to a windowless office, where a man in a crisp shirt and tie waited behind a desk, his nameplate reading Lieutenant. Samuel Greer, retired, Department of Military Records and Legacy Identification. He motioned for her to sit. "You're the nurse who submitted the report on Lieutenant Column Henry Dawson?" "Yes," she said, placing a folder on the desk. "He died 2 weeks ago in our ER. No family listed, no ID. I found his service number on a bracelet and started digging. I found this." She slid the copy of the death certificate, the photo, and Emily's letter across the desk. Lieutenant Greer adjusted his glasses, his brow creasing as he scanned the papers. The longer he read, the stiller he became. Finally, he looked up. "Miss Walker, are you aware that Henry Dawson was declared deceased in 2001? Grace's heart skipped. What? He was marked as presumed dead. No contact with the VA, no benefit claims, no official address. After several failed attempts to locate him, the military listed him as missing with presumed death. His record's been closed for over 2 decades. Grace sat back, stunned. But he wasn't missing. He was here. He'd been living under the radar, still wearing his jacket, still holding on to a photo of a woman named Emily. He remembered everything. Greer's voice softened. Some men never come back, not in the way the system expects. They carry the war with them, the grief, the promises. He turned the photo over in his hands. I served with men like him, quiet heroes, the kind who kept the world spinning while everyone else slept. He pulled a binder from the cabinet behind him and flipped through pages until he stopped at a photo. Henry, in uniform, saluting during a retirement ceremony. The same eyes, the same solemn face. "You're right," he said. "This is Dawson. There's no doubt." Grace swallowed hard. He didn't want attention, but he deserves recognition. He kept a promise for a friend who died in war, and when he died, he wasn't alone. I just thought someone should know. Lieutenant Greer nodded, voice firm now. "They will." He stood, extending his hand. "Thank you for bringing him back." And in that moment, Grace realized that what she had done wasn't just about honoring one man. It was about restoring a story the world had forgotten and making sure, at long last, it was heard. The hospital returned to its usual rhythm, fast-paced, unrelenting, indifferent. IVs beeped, stretchers rolled in, phones rang endlessly. And Grace moved through it all like she always had, calm, steady, efficient. But something inside her was different now. It had been 4 days since her visit to the records office. 4 days since she'd handed over the proof of Henry Dawson's life and death. 4 days since Lieutenant Greer had promised, "They will know." And still, nothing. No phone calls, no visitors, no updates. Room 4 had long since been reassigned. A boy with a broken leg had occupied it 2 nights ago, a woman with chest pain the next. The bed had been stripped, sanitized, and reset so many times that even the scent of Henry's cologne, subtle, pine and dust, was gone. Like he had never been there at all. Grace didn't speak of it to anyone. Not Patrice, not the other nurses. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was just that they had seen too many goodbyes. Too many people with no one to claim them. They processed loss the way ERs always did. Quickly, efficiently, and without looking back. But Grace looked back. Often. She kept the photo of Henry and Sam on her locker door, tucked behind her ID badge. She reread Emily's letter at night before bed. She still caught herself watching the entrance around 7 a.m., half expecting someone in uniform to walk in, asking for her by name. But each day passed quietly. Sometimes she wondered if the world had already moved on. If Henry's story, his promise, his sacrifice, would remain buried beneath bureaucracy and time. Maybe all she'd done was stir the surface of something too deep to matter anymore. The silence weighed more heavily than she expected. Yet, she kept going. Because that's what nurses do. She wrapped sprains, checked vitals, comforted families. She listened. She stayed late. She smiled at patients even when exhaustion tugged at the corners of her mouth. And every night, as she untied her scrubs and turned off her lamp, she thought of Henry, of the bracelet, of his last words. Tell her thank you. I kept my promise. Maybe no one would ever show up. Maybe no one else would remember. But Grace did. And that, for now, had to be enough. The storm rolled in without warning, dark clouds swallowing the afternoon sun, the sky cracking open with a sudden downpour that streaked the ER windows like tears. Inside, the waiting room buzzed with the usual symphony of low murmurs, coughing, and the soft flick of magazine pages. Grace stood at the medication cart near the nurse's station, double-checking a dosage when something unusual caught her eye through the front glass doors. Headlights, not just one, but four, cutting through the rain in precise formation. She walked closer, drawn by a growing sense of unease. 4 matte black SUVs turned off the road and into the hospital parking lot, moving with slow, deliberate precision. Government plates, tinted windows. Their tires sliced through puddles, coming to a stop just feet from the main entrance. For a moment, the hospital lobby seemed to hold its breath. The first SUV's door opened. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed not in civilian clothes, but in a military uniform adorned with medals and ribbons that glittered despite the gloom. Then another officer exited, and another. A fourth SUV door opened, revealing yet another pair of figures in full dress uniform. They moved in perfect silence, forming a line beneath the entrance awning, rain pelting their caps and shoulders without notice or care. One of them held a briefcase. Another cradled something wrapped tightly in folded linen, small, solemn, unmistakably ceremonial. Inside, the receptionist stood up, mouth slightly parted. Patients turned in their seats. A mother pulled her child closer. Even the beeping monitors seemed to hush in reverence. Grace stepped forward, heart racing. She didn't know how, but she knew. The glass doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and the men stepped inside. The air shifted, more than just rain-soaked fabric and polished leather. It was presence, gravity. The lead officer scanned the room, then approached the desk with crisp steps. "We're here to speak with Nurse Grace Walker," he said, voice clear and calm. The receptionist's wide eyes flicked to Grace. She stepped forward slowly, her scrubs damp at the cuffs, her breath catching in her chest. "I'm Grace." The man's expression softened just slightly, but his posture remained perfectly composed. He removed his cap and gave a respectful nod. "We've come on behalf of the United States Army," he said, "and Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dawson." Behind him, the others remained at attention. Grace didn't speak, couldn't. The silence was too loud, the meaning too immense. But in her chest, something surged, recognition, validation, and the beginning of something far greater than she ever imagined. Henry's story wasn't over. Not anymore. The doors parted again with a gentle whoosh, ushering in the sound of rainfall and the heavy steps of polished boots. The man who entered next moved differently than the others. Slower, more deliberate, his presence unmistakable. His shoulders were squared beneath layers of ceremonial medals, his dress uniform sharp and rain-spotted, his white-gloved hands steady at his sides. A general, not just a high-ranking officer, but someone who had spent a lifetime carrying the weight of decisions that echoed far beyond a battlefield. The gold trim on his epaulets caught the flickering overhead lights. His chest bore so many commendations, they looked less like decoration and more like testament. He paused just inside the entrance, looked once across the room, and then his eyes found Grace. He stepped forward with quiet authority, flanked by 2 younger officers whose movements echoed his. A few paces behind, hands clasped, solemn as shadows. "Nurse Grace Walker?" the general asked. Her throat felt tight. "Yes." He came to a stop in front of her. "I'm General Franklin R. Delaney, commanding officer, Joint Veterans Affairs Council. He offered a hand, not stiff, not formal, but warm, human. She shook it, her own fingers trembling slightly. "It's an honor," she managed. "No," he said, voice low and resolute. "The honor is ours." From behind him, one of the junior officers stepped forward, holding out a sealed envelope with a military insignia pressed into the flap. "We've come on behalf of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dawson," Delaney said. "We received your report, verified your findings, and read your account of his final moments." Grace accepted the envelope with both hands, as if it might break beneath her touch. "He was a decorated war hero," the general continued. "But more than that, he was a man of extraordinary loyalty. His life ended in silence, but you gave it meaning again. Dignity, witness." The ER lobby was frozen now. Patients, nurses, even the janitor, all unmoving, watching, unsure if what they were seeing was ceremony or history. "We lost track of Henry years ago," Delaney said quietly. "Assume the worst. But in truth, he never left the mission. You brought him home." Grace felt her eyes sting. "He said he kept a promise," she whispered. "Those were his last words." Delaney nodded. "And now we're here to fulfill one of our own." Behind him, another officer reached into a case and withdrew something wrapped in cloth, a flag neatly folded. Grace pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed. The general stepped back, allowing the gesture to unfold. And in that moment, amidst the fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic and the rhythm of quiet awe, Grace realized Henry Dawson had not been forgotten, and neither had she. General Delaney stood at attention, his expression composed, but his eyes softened by something unspoken. Respect, perhaps, or gratitude that ran deeper than any prepared speech could express. The folded flag now rested in his hands, crisp and ceremonial, the stars a deep navy against white cotton creases. It wasn't just cloth, it was history. A lifetime condensed into a triangle of silence and honor. He stepped forward and placed the flag in Grace's arms with the careful precision of someone who understood what it meant. "On behalf of the United States Armed Forces," he said, his voice clear in the stillness, "we thank you for the dignity you offered Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dawson in his final moments, for the humanity, the kindness, and the witness. Your actions ensured that a hero did not die alone, and for that, you have our eternal gratitude." Grace held the flag close, her fingers curling gently around the edges. It felt heavier than she expected, not in weight, but in meaning. Then came the next gesture. One of the officers stepped forward with a small velvet box. Inside was a coin, gold, round, and inscribed with the insignia of the United States Army and the words, "Valor in Compassion." Around the edge, "For service beyond duty." The general took the coin himself, walked it to her, and pressed it gently into her hand. "This is a challenge coin," he explained, "usually given from one soldier to another. But today, we make an exception. Because you, Miss Walker, did something many forget to do. You saw him." Grace blinked rapidly, trying to keep her composure, but her voice cracked when she replied. "He deserved it." "He did," Delaney said. "And now, because of you, everyone else knows it." There was a pause. Then the general straightened, raised his hand to his brow, and delivered a sharp, formal salute. One by one, the officers behind him followed. Then the guards still waiting outside in the rain, visible through the glass, mirrored the motion. And then something extraordinary happened. One of the ER security guards, moved by the moment, came to attention and saluted. Then a nurse. Then a veteran sitting in a wheelchair by the lobby. Without a word, the room filled with people standing, not for show, not out of obligation, but because something sacred was happening in a hospital known more for broken bones than moments of reverence. Grace stood in the center of it all, holding the folded flag to her chest, the coin of valor resting against her palm. She didn't speak. She couldn't. But she didn't need to. The silence said everything. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle by the time the ceremony began. The convoy had parked in a crescent around the hospital entrance, engines off, the men and women in uniform standing at disciplined attention under the muted gray sky. Word had spread quickly, first among the staff, then to patients, and finally to bystanders who gathered at the edge of the lot, unsure what was happening, but sensing it was something important. Grace stood beside General Delaney under the awning, the folded flag still in her arms, its corners pressed tightly to her chest. The coin of valor remained tucked into her scrub pocket, warm from the heat of her hand. Around her, nurses had slipped outside during their breaks, surgical techs still in scrubs with shoe covers, even a doctor with his stethoscope still around his neck. The general stepped forward to address the crowd. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Today," he said, "we gather to honor the life of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Thomas Dawson, a soldier who gave his country decades of service and who, through the compassion of a stranger, did not die forgotten." He paused, letting the silence breathe. Sometimes it's not medals or headlines that define a hero's final chapter. Sometimes it's the quiet presence of someone who stays when they don't have to, who listens, who sees. He turned to Grace then, his voice softening. Nurse Grace Walker gave that final gift. She stayed. She honored him. And because of her, we are able to honor him too. A bugle's first note pierced the air, solemn and unhurried. Taps. The music flowed gently over the crowd, over the building, over the flag in Grace's arms. No one moved. Not the children in the waiting room watching through the glass, not the elderly man in the wheelchair who had insisted on being rolled outside, not even the staff who'd seen death 100 times. Today, it meant something different. As the final note faded, 2 soldiers stepped forward and placed a small plaque against the ER wall near the entrance. Etched into it were simple words: "In honor of Lieutenant Colonel Henry T. Dawson, and the kindness that brought him home." No applause followed, just the hush of reverence, the kind of silence that binds people who know they've just witnessed something real. Grace stood quietly as the soldiers turned on their heels and saluted once more. The flag in her arms felt less like an object now, and more like a memory, something she was entrusted to carry, not just hold. And when the rain began again, no one moved. Because for the first time in a long time, they were standing not just in front of a hospital, but at the edge of something sacred. By the next morning, the whispers had already begun. It started in the hospital corridors, nurses from the day shift asking questions in hushed tones, wondering why military vehicles had lined up outside like a silent salute. A doctor mentioned hearing that a general had come through the ER. One patient claimed they'd seen a bugle player. Another swore they'd seen tears on the face of the famously stoic chief of surgery. Then came the article. A reporter from the local paper had been tipped off and captured a photo of Grace standing outside in the rain, flag in her arms, her expression unreadable but unmistakably solemn. The headline read, "Nurse honors forgotten soldier in silent farewell." The story spread fast. Online groups shared it. The local radio station mentioned her by name. Messages trickled in, some handwritten, some emailed. Veterans from nearby towns wrote to thank her. Strangers dropped off flowers at the nurses' station. Someone left a box of warm pastries with a note taped to the top. For the nurse who remembered what dignity looks like. Grace took it all with quiet humility. She responded with polite nods and a soft, practiced smile. But when someone asked her how it felt to be a hero, she only shook her head. "I didn't do anything special," she'd say. "I just held a hand." But the town didn't see it that way. At the grocery store, someone stopped her in the aisle and pressed her hand with trembling fingers. "My brother died overseas. I always hoped someone like you would have been there at the end." In the coffee shop, her order came with a scribbled message on the cup. "Paid for by someone grateful." At the hospital, more and more veterans came in, some for treatment, some just to sit near the plaque by the ER entrance, where Henry Dawson's name now lived in quiet permanence. Grace never asked for the attention. She never sought the spotlight. But somehow, her simple act had rippled outward in ways she couldn't have imagined. And yet, when she closed her locker at the end of each shift and looked at the photo taped inside, Henry and Sam, grinning in the sun, she still thought of the night she'd sat beside a man the world thought was gone and listened to his last words. "Tell her thank you. I kept my promise." That's what stayed with her. Not the praise, not the headlines, just the weight of a hand in hers, and the knowledge that sometimes showing up is everything. By the end of the week, Grace's quiet life had become anything but. What began as a small-town tribute exploded into national headlines after a news anchor in D.C. opened a segment with the words, "One nurse, one soldier, one final act of grace." The broadcast aired with footage of the ceremony outside the ER, Grace clutching the folded flag, the salute, the rain falling like a benediction. From there, everything snowballed. Major news outlets picked up the story. Her hospital received so many calls the switchboard crashed twice. Photos of Grace circulated online, her face soft, eyes focused, always holding something, whether it was a clipboard, a coffee cup, or a piece of someone else's sorrow. Grace, however, didn't watch the interviews or read the comments. She didn't go online. Her inbox overflowed, but she read only 1 or 2 emails a night, usually after her shift, when the world had finally gone quiet again. But the letters, those she couldn't ignore. They came in waves, handwritten, typed, printed in shaky cursive and tight, methodical script. Many were marked simply, "To Grace Walker, nurse." A mother in Ohio wrote, "My son passed in a VA hospital, and no one was there. I pray someone like you had been." A veteran's daughter from Florida sent a photo of her father, smiling in uniform. "He died 3 years ago, but he was also a lieutenant. Colonel, I see him in your Henry. Thank you for giving someone else's father the goodbye he deserved." One envelope contained a Purple Heart replica on a chain and a note that read, "You earned this in spirit." Grace read each one slowly, absorbing the weight behind every word. These weren't fan letters. They were grief poured into ink. Thanks born from wounds still healing. People weren't writing because she had made headlines. They were writing because, somehow, she had touched a part of them that still ached for someone lost. Still, when asked to give interviews, Grace declined them all. At the hospital, she kept her head down, tended her patients, and made sure room 4 stayed just a room, not a shrine. She smiled when people thanked her. She nodded when they spoke of heroes. But inside, her truth never changed. She hadn't planned to change anything. She hadn't tried to be remembered. She had simply sat beside a dying man and held his hand while he whispered his final words. And now, because of that simple gesture, thousands of people across the country were remembering what mattered most: dignity, presence, human kindness, and a promise kept. The envelope arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, tucked among hospital bulletins and prescription forms in Grace's mailbox. She recognized the return address instantly: Colorado. Her heart skipped. She took the envelope in both hands, suddenly aware of its weight. It was addressed in careful handwriting. To Nurse Grace Walker. From Clara Harrow. Inside, folded neatly, was a letter and a small photograph enclosed in wax paper. The moment Grace opened it, the past unfolded in her hands. Dear Miss Walker, my name is Clara Harrow. Emily Harrow was my mother. I heard about you through a family friend who saw your story on the news. When he mentioned Henry Dawson, I knew immediately who he was. My mother spoke of him often, especially in her later years. She always wondered if he was still out there, still trying to find her. I think a part of her hoped he was, even when it seemed impossible. You see, Henry was my father's best friend. They served together in Vietnam. My father didn't come home, but Henry did. And before he left, he promised to tell my mother that my father died thinking of her. She waited years for that message. She never stopped believing he'd keep his word. She passed in 1996. I think it would bring her peace to know that Henry never forgot her, that he searched, that in the end, someone like you was there to hear his final promise fulfilled. Thank you for being that someone. Enclosed is a photo of Henry as a young soldier. I found it among my mother's things after she died. She must have kept it all those years. I think it belongs with someone who saw him for who he really was, not just a name or a file, but a man who kept his word to the very end. With deep gratitude, Clara Harrow. Grace unfolded the wax paper carefully and lifted the photograph. It showed Henry, no older than 25, in full uniform. He stood in the shadow of a tent, sunlight slanting across his face. His expression was proud, steady, alive. She traced his outline with her eyes, the strong jaw, the sharp eyes, the half-smile that hinted at the man who would someday carry a promise across decades. It was the first time she'd seen him like this, young, hopeful, whole. She pressed the letter to her chest, eyes stinging. Clara had never met her, yet somehow she had handed her the last missing piece of Henry's story. Proof not just of the promise, but of the love that had lived on both ends of it. Grace placed the photo beside the folded flag on her shelf, resting it in a frame. Now, finally, Henry had found his way home. The ER never stopped moving, its rhythm a constant hum of beeping monitors, quick footsteps, and clipped voices navigating crisis after crisis. But something had changed, not in the noise or the chaos, but in the way people moved through it. They watched a little longer. They listened more closely. And when someone arrived alone, unconscious, unclaimed, there was a quiet shift in how that aloneness was treated. It began with a conversation in the break room. Dr. Rayner, head of emergency medicine, stood holding his coffee, eyes tired but thoughtful. "We can't be Grace," he'd said, glancing toward her locker. "But maybe we can be what she reminded us to be." 2 weeks later, the first sign went up on the bulletin board beside the nursing station. Simple, printed in bold type, "Silent Watch Program. No one dies alone. Volunteers needed for bedside presence. 1-hour shifts, all departments welcome. Sign-up sheet below." Grace hadn't proposed the idea. She hadn't even known about it until she saw the form. The first name on the list wasn't a nurse or a doctor. It was the janitor, Miguel, who had been mopping the hallway the night Henry passed. Below his name were more: an X-ray tech, a young intern, a retired nurse who asked to come back just for this. 1 shift at a time, people signed up. They brought books, music. Some sat in silence, some held hands. No medical care, no procedures, just presence. They called it Silent Watch, but in truth, it spoke volumes. The hospital created a small room adjacent to the ER, with 2 chairs, a reading lamp, and a drawer stocked with comfort items, blankets, chaplain cards, journals. Volunteers would be paged when someone with no listed family came in, especially if the end seemed near. And they would go, quietly, without fanfare. Grace volunteered, of course, but she never spoke of Henry while doing so. She didn't need to. The plaque by the entrance said enough. The flag still hung discreetly in the waiting room, a symbol of what one kind act could inspire. Sometimes during a shift, she'd pass the silent watchroom and peek inside to see someone she never expected. A surgical resident humming quietly, a security guard reading aloud from a magazine, a receptionist holding the hand of a man who hadn't spoken in 2 days. In those moments, Grace didn't feel like a hero. She just felt human. And she knew, wherever Henry was now, he wasn't alone anymore. No one would be. The package came in a small, unmarked padded envelope, slipped quietly into her hospital mailbox between supply receipts and department memos. No return address, no handwriting, just her name, typed neatly. Grace Walker. Inside, cushioned in soft black velvet, was a single dog tag. It wasn't like the standard issue tags she'd seen on veterans over the years. No blood type, no military codes. This one was different. It had weight, both literal and emotional, and a polished finish that reflected the pale light of the break room as she turned it over in her hand. The engraving was clean, purposeful. Lieutenant Column Henry T. Dawson. You kept his promise. Grace sat down slowly, the tag nestled in her palm. It felt cold at first, then strangely warm, as if it had waited a long time to find her. There was no note, no signature, but she didn't need one. Someone had sent this with intention. Someone who understood that what she'd done, what she still carried, deserved remembrance. Not medals or ceremonies, not headlines or standing ovations, just something quiet, personal. A weight she could wear, close to her heart, on the days when the world rushed on and left no space for memory. She threaded the chain through her fingers and fastened it around her neck, tucking the tag beneath her scrub top. It rested just over her sternum, right where Henry's head had leaned when he took his final breath. Later that shift, a fellow nurse asked about the shape beneath her collar. Grace smiled softly and shook her head. Just something a patient left behind. But when she passed the plaque at the ER entrance, the one honoring Henry, the one people stopped to read when they felt the ache of being forgotten, she touched the tag through her shirt and whispered, just for him, I never made the promise, but I'm glad you let me help keep it. And in that quiet moment, Grace didn't feel like someone who had simply held a hand. She felt like a keeper of memory, a witness to something sacred, a token around her neck, a legacy she would carry. The idea came from the maintenance staff. It started as a conversation between Miguel, the janitor who'd been the first to sign up for Silent Watch, and one of the hospital volunteers who often restocked the comfort cart. Feels like some people ought to be remembered, Miguel had said, wiping down a bench outside the ER. Not the loud ones, the quiet ones, the ones who stay. 3 weeks later, a section of the West Corridor was cleared, just past the nurses' station, near the family waiting room. The walls were repainted a soft slate gray, and a bronze plaque was mounted at eye level. Its inscription read, The Wall of Quiet Heroes. For those who stayed, for those who saw, for those who made sure no one left this world alone. At first, there were only a few framed photos, grainy snapshots of nurses reading beside patients, a tech holding an elderly man's hand, a cafeteria worker sitting with a teenager after hours until her parents arrived. Moments too small for charts, too sacred for ceremony. But the wall began to grow. Families sent in letters. Former patients dropped off photos. One man returned weeks after his father's passing, carrying a single Polaroid of Grace, holding the old man's hand through the ICU window during lockdown. She didn't know I saw her, he said, but I never forgot. The hospital printed each tribute on matte paper, framed in simple wood. Below every photo was a name and a line describing the act, not with flair, but with truth. Held a veteran's hand until he passed. Sang to a patient with no family. Stayed past her shift to sit with a scared child. It became a place of stillness in the middle of chaos. Staff passed by and slowed their steps. Visitors paused. Doctors with full slates stood quietly for a few minutes before heading back into the fray. It reminded everyone what had always mattered, even before anyone had given it a name. Grace didn't expect to see herself there. But one day she rounded the corner on her way to deliver discharge papers and stopped short. There she was. Not a staged photo, just a candid shot, taken during the ceremony outside. She was holding the folded flag, her face unreadable, but undeniably present. Below it, Grace Walker, RN. She didn't let him go alone. She stared for a long time, one hand absently reaching for the dog tag resting against her chest. She didn't cry. She just nodded, touched the frame lightly, and moved on. Because she wasn't the only one. And now, no one had to wonder if those quiet acts mattered. They were etched into the wall, into memory, into the kind of history you don't always see until someone stops and whispers, "Look there." That's what real courage looks like. It was a warm spring morning when the SUV returned. Not four this time, just one. Black, unmarked, its engine humming low as it rolled into the hospital parking lot. No fanfare, no ceremony, just quiet purpose. Grace noticed it from the nurse's station window as she refilled a tray of saline bags. At first, she thought nothing of it. But then the door opened, and a young man in uniform stepped out. He was maybe 20, maybe younger, his boots still stiff with newness, his posture crisp and careful. His gaze scanned the hospital entrance with the kind of look that said he was here for someone specific. For her. Grace met him outside before he even reached the automatic doors. He snapped to attention the moment he saw her. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady. "Are you Nurse Grace Walker?" She nodded. "I am." The soldier eased his stance and reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small sealed envelope. It was worn at the corners, like it had been carried for a long time. He offered it with both hands, almost reverently. "This is for you," he said, "from someone who wanted to make sure you knew." She took the envelope, heart beginning to race. The young man hesitated, then looked her in the eye. He told his CO, just before he passed, that if anything ever came of it, if someone found him, if someone stayed, he wanted them to be told. Grace stared at him, the envelope trembling slightly in her grip. Told what? The soldier smiled softly, a kind of quiet respect in his expression that seemed older than his years. "That you mattered," he said. "More than you'll ever understand." Grace didn't speak. Couldn't. He offered a sharp salute, then turned back toward the SUV. No one else stepped out. There were no cameras, no commanders, just the message and the man who'd come to deliver it. She stood in the doorway long after the vehicle pulled away, envelope clutched to her chest, the echo of those words still hanging in the morning air. "You mattered." She opened it slowly once she was alone. Inside was a second dog tag, this one inscribed simply with her name and a single line beneath it. "For keeping watch. For keeping faith." No signature, no title. Just a closing phrase written in Henry Dawson's unmistakable hand. "I wasn't alone because of you." Grace pressed her fingers to the words, blinking back tears. She didn't need the world to remember. She didn't need applause or headlines. She had this. A promise fulfilled. And proof that kindness, quiet, unasked for, unseen by most, could still echo across time.